right, so listen to this. We're going to deep dive into a world with 700 corporate lobbyists.
Wow.
Rubbing shoulders with a Treasury Minister, Lord Livermore himself.
Okay.
It wasn't some, clandestine meeting.
Right.
It was a webinar laid out in an Open Democracy article from January 31st, 2025, and they're calling lobbyists partners.
Partners.
Which sounds pretty cozy.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think about, how policy is shaped and who really has influence.
Right.
When you see that kind of access, you have to think about the potential for conflicts and interest.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when you look at all the different industries represented. I mean,
Yeah.
We're talking banks, arms manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, tech giants, energy companies.
It's like
It's everyone.
Yeah, it's like a who's who of powerful industries. And this article points to a concerning theme that runs through this webinar and the government's whole approach, this growth at all costs thing.
Growth at all costs.
What does that actually mean in practice? And
Yeah.
what could it mean for everyday people?
Yeah. Well, growth at all costs basically means prioritizing economic expansion above everything else.
Okay.
So things like social equality, environmental protection, those things might take a back seat to the single goal of just boosting GDP. And Lord Livermore was quoted saying, growth comes from business, not the government.
Interesting.
And this, together with the government's plan to de-risk investments, which basically means minimizing potential losses for investors, paints a picture of a government that's stepping back from its regulatory role and placing a lot of reliance on the private sector to fuel growth.
So they're essentially saying, businesses, you're in the driver's seat and we'll smooth the road for you.
Yeah, basically.
But where does that leave the average person?
Right.
And what happens when this, relentless pursuit of growth clashes with the need for environmental regulations or social safety nets?
Well, that's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
The article mentions this National Wealth Fund, which is a pool of money.
Right.
That's meant to benefit the whole country.
Right.
But if the government prioritizes de-risking investments for the private sector above all else, how does that impact the management and allocation of funds within the National Wealth Fund?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like they're putting all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
The article also talks about deregulation being a key focus for this government. They even replaced the competition regulator with a former Amazon executive.
Yeah, and that's a deliberate move.
Right.
It shows a clear preference for less government oversight and a freer hand for businesses. And while people who like deregulation say it can boost innovation and competition, critics are worried about the potential consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, regulation exists to protect consumers and workers and the environment.
And it's not just hypothetical either. We have real-world examples of where a lack of oversight was a disaster.
Oh, yeah.
The Grenfell Tower tragedy exposed the dangers of not having strict building regulations.
Grenfell Tower, that fire, where they didn't have good fire safety measures, and it led to so many people dying, is a really stark reminder of what can happen when economic efficiency is prioritized over public safety.
Absolutely. So it looks like there's this delicate balance to strike between fostering economic growth and making sure there are essential protections for people and the environment.
Right.
And this leads to the criticisms of this growth at all costs agenda. The Green Party especially has been very vocal in its opposition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Zach Polanski, the Green Party deputy leader, argues that this focus on growth could lead to a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. He's worried it will mostly benefit the people at the top and leave ordinary people behind.
Yeah, so it's like that classic trickle-down economics argument.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The idea that if you just keep making the rich richer, the benefits will magically trickle down to everyone else.
Yeah.
But that hasn't really happened historically, has it?
No, not really.
And Polanski's critique goes beyond economic inequality, too.
Okay.
He's also concerned about the potential damage to the environment from a growth-at-all-costs approach.
Yeah, makes sense.
While the government talks about investing in renewable energy, Polanski worries that important environmental protections might be ignored to achieve economic goals faster.
Yeah, so we have this potential conflict between economic growth and environmental sustainability.
Right. And it's not just the Green Party that's worried about this.
No, you're right. We're hearing from academics, activists, even some business leaders.
Interesting.
Urging caution when it comes to deregulation and saying we need a more balanced approach.
It seems like a lot of people are questioning this growth at all costs idea and what it could mean in the long run.
Yeah, for sure.
But before we look more at those consequences, there's one more thing in the article I wanted to mention.
Okay.
It seems that there were some people connected to the Labor Party at this webinar. This makes me wonder if this close relationship with corporate lobbyists is something that happens across the political spectrum, not just a conservative thing.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It definitely challenges that assumption that this is just a conservative strategy.
Yeah.
It might mean that this blurring of lines between government and business interests is happening more broadly, and that's something worth investigating further.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've set the stage. We've got this growth at all costs agenda, a cozy relationship between the government and lobbyists, and potential concerns about the impact on everyday people and the environment.
Exactly.
And in the next part, we can dig deeper into those potential consequences, explore different approaches to economic growth,
right,
and most importantly, talk about what all of this means for you, the listener.
Sounds good.
So we've got this picture of the government really pushing for growth at all costs, with corporate lobbyists right there with them. It's like they're handing the keys to the economy over and saying, drive. But is this really the best way forward, this focus on economic expansion?
Well, it's definitely a popular idea. But more and more people are worried about whether it's sustainable and how it will impact society. Let's think about what could happen with this approach, starting with deregulation.
Okay, so less regulation might sound good at first. Less red tape, more freedom for businesses to operate, maybe leading to more innovation and jobs. But what are we giving up in this push for economic efficiency?
That's the big question. While deregulation might boost the economy in the short term, it can also make things unstable and cause harm in the long run.
Right.
Take the 2008 financial crisis, for example.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge global economic shock.
It was, and one of the things that contributed to it was deregulation in the financial industry. They loosened lending standards, and there wasn't enough oversight, so risky practices were allowed to happen. And eventually, the housing market collapsed, and that sent shockwaves through the entire global economy.
So it's a case of short-term gains leading to long-term pain.
Exactly. And it shows that we need balance. Regulation, when done right, can act as a safety net, making sure things are fair and stable and protecting both businesses and individuals. It's not about stopping innovation, but about creating a system where growth happens responsibly.
And this brings us back to what the Green Party is saying. They aren't just worried about economic inequality. They're also worried about what a growth at all costs agenda could do to the environment.
Right. They're arguing that if we put economic expansion above everything else, we might start ignoring environmental regulations, which would put our natural resources and ecosystems at risk.
And we're already seeing the effects of climate change around the world. Things like extreme weather, rising sea levels, problems with food systems.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It shows us that the environment isn't just some abstract concept. It's what our well-being depends on. If we damage it just to get some short-term economic gains, the consequences will be huge and they won't be reversible.
So then how do we balance these different needs? How do we create an economic system that puts people and the planet first? Are there other ways to think about this besides growth at all costs?
There are, and a lot of economists and policymakers are saying we need to shift away from just focusing on growth and move towards sustainable development. This would mean thinking about the social and environmental costs of economic activity and trying to make sure wealth is distributed more fairly.
So it's about looking beyond just GDP as a measure of progress.
Exactly. It's about realizing that real prosperity includes things like social well-being, a healthy environment, and a society that's just and fair.
And this brings us back to you, the listener. What do you think about all of this? Do you think we can keep growing the economy forever, or are you worried about the potential consequences?
It's something to really think about because these aren't just theoretical discussions happening somewhere else. They directly affect your life. They influence things like the quality of the air you breathe and the water you drink, whether you can afford a place to live if you have access to health care, what kind of job you can get.
So this isn't just about economics. It's about what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of future we want to create.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be informed to talk about these things and to make sure our policymakers are doing what's right.
Right. Because ultimately, in a democracy, the people have the power, but that power only matters if we use it.
Absolutely. And using it doesn't always mean doing something big. It can start with small things like learning about the issues, talking to your friends and family supporting organizations that share your values, contacting your elected officials.
It's about speaking up, making sure people hear your concerns, and being involved in shaping your community and your country.
You're right. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people and groups working to create a future that's more just sustainable, and fair.
Now let's go back to that webinar with the Treasury Minister and all those corporate lobbyists. It makes you wonder, how much influence do regular citizens really have when businesses have that much access to policymakers?
That's the million-dollar question. And we need to talk about it directly, because if we let corporate interests control things, we risk ending up with a system where most people's needs are ignored so that a few people can benefit.
It's like that saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If we aren't involved, if we don't speak up, then we might not be heard over those who have the money and access to influence decisions.
That's why things like grassroots movements, citizen activism, and investigative journalism are so important. They provide a balance to the power of corporate lobbying and help make sure that everyday people's interests are represented in the policymaking process.
So it's about making sure everyone has a fair chance, making sure everyone's voice is heard in the decisions that affect their lives.
Exactly, and it's about demanding transparency and accountability from the people we elect. We need to know who they're meeting with, who's influencing them, and whether what they're doing actually reflects what their constituents want.
It all comes back to the idea of being an active citizen. We can't just sit around and expect things to magically change. We have to be informed, engaged, and involved in creating the future we want.
You're absolutely right. And that's a perfect transition to our final thought for today. Given that the government is saying they're relying on businesses to make the economy grow, how much influence do you think individuals have in shaping the country's economic direction?
That's a great question to think about. And it's one that we each need to answer for ourselves. But I think we have more power than we realize. We just need to recognize it and use it wisely.
So true. Don't underestimate your own power, listeners.
Yeah.
Get informed, get engaged, and get active. The future's in our hands.
You know, it's interesting because on the one hand, they're saying businesses, you're the engine of growth. But then at the same time, they seem to be trying to control what businesses can even say.
Yeah.
The article talks about a lobbyist who actually criticized some businesses for speaking out against how the government's handling the economy.
Right, and that makes you wonder how open they really are to different opinions.
Yeah, exactly.
This lobbyist even asks how businesses that want to say positive things can work best with the government. Sounds like they want everyone to agree with them instead of having real discussions.
It does make you wonder what happens to businesses that don't go along with it.
Yeah.
Do they get left out of these so-called partnerships and miss out on opportunities?
It's definitely possible, and it shows one of the problems with this close relationship between the government and certain industries. It could create an unfair situation where those who disagree or have different ideas get pushed aside.
So how can we as citizens make sure that different perspectives are heard, especially when there's so much pressure to present a united front?
I think it comes down to thinking critically and being informed. We can't just accept what we're told, even if it seems like it's coming from a reliable source.
Right.
We need to question things, analyze them, and look for other viewpoints.
So it's about doing our own research.
Exactly.
Not just relying on quick sound bites or headlines, but really digging into the issues and forming our own opinions.
Right. And it's also about having respectful conversations with people who see things differently.
Yeah.
We may not always agree, but by talking things through, we can understand these complicated issues better and try to find solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, so to bring this back to our listeners, why should they care about what happened at this webinar with a bunch of lobbyists and a Treasury Minister? How does this whole growth at all costs agenda affect them in their everyday lives?
It affects them in so many ways, even if they don't see it directly. This agenda shapes the policies that decide things like how good their health care is, whether they can afford a place to live, how safe their workplaces are, what's going to happen to the environment.
Wow.
It even influences what kind of jobs there are, how much education costs, and the safety net that's supposed to protect the most vulnerable people in society.
So it's not just some abstract economic theory. It's about the real things people deal with every day.
That's exactly it. And that's why it's so important for people to understand how this all works, to see how much influence lobbying has, and to make their voices heard in the political process.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, a democracy only works if its citizens are active and informed.
Could agree more. We can't just leave it to the lobbyists and the politicians to decide what the future looks like. We all have a role to play, and we all have a responsibility to get involved.
So what can people do? Where should they even start?
Well, they can start by staying informed. Read articles from reliable sources, listen to different perspectives, have conversations with people, then take action.
Okay.
Support organizations that you believe in, contact your friends, your elected officials, participate in peaceful protests or demonstrations, and most importantly, vote.
Those are great suggestions.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that even small things can make a difference.
Absolutely.
It's about finding what speaks to you and using your voice in whatever way feels right for you.
Exactly. It's about realizing that you do have power, even if it doesn't always feel like it. And when we all use our power together, we can create real change.
So, listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about this. Don't underestimate your own ability to make a difference. Get informed, get engaged, and get active. The future is ours to shape.
Well said. And remember, we've only just scratched the surface of this complex issue. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working towards a better world.
We'll be here with you every step of the way, diving deep into the topics that matter. Thanks for listening.